Hello, I'm Richard Sheehy. I'm a senior research fellow at the George Mason University Department of Communications, and I'm very pleased to be moderating the press conference today for the next hour. We're going to be talking about character assassination and reputation politics. And we've got members of the CARP Research Lab with us here, all online. Martin Ix, Eric Sharayev, Jenny Kohane, and Sergey Samoyenko are all joining me today, and we're going to be talking about the bread and butter of what the CARP Research Lab does, which I'll summarize very briefly, but then we'll really just try to get into the questions so we can make the best use of our time. The CARP Research Lab includes scholars with disciplinary homes in psychology, history, communication, and public relations, and it includes investigators both at George Mason University and the University of Amsterdam. And the team really focuses not just on one dimension, but three main parallel tracks to really understand character assassination in all of its forms. That includes research on historical and contemporary examples of character assassination, education for academic and public audiences to understand more about character assassination, its causes, its impacts, and prevention. And they focus on risk assessment to determine vulnerabilities and mitigation strategies for public figures who are dealing with character assassination. And I would probably venture to say the modern political climate means that they're dealing with it on a daily basis. So let me start with that question of politics. We have folks, and actually I should step back for a moment and say that we have a YouTube channel, as you probably see, and there is a live chat function. So by all means, feel free to, I'll have a few questions to get the discussion started, but we have, we have the entire hour to really also see what questions you have out there. So we'll be keeping an eye on the chat window, and as we see questions, we'll be able to sort of throw it out to our experts. So with that, I will start with the idea of politics. And again, this is, from our perspective as researchers, it's a nonpartisan perspective that we have. But at the same time, we see character assassination and issues of character and reputation played out in the political sphere. And this past week in the United States, at least, it was the first major election since the 2016 election. So I wanted to ask the panelists, any thoughts on how these issues of character and reputation, you had a major successful conference back in March, and a lot of the subjects that came up, and we'll probably talk about it a little later, had to do with the 2016 presidential election. But I'm really curious, in light of what you've seen in this election cycle just this past week, any observations on how the issues and the dynamics of character have changed just from 2016 to this year? And I'll just, I'm not sure who to throw that out to. Everybody, maybe Jenny Kohane, since I see you on the screen.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for helping us out moderating today, Richard. I'm excited to be here and to talk about this. And I think everything that you just said is right on, that this is a really important time for us to be thinking about and talking about character assassination. I guess I can talk a little bit about what just happened on Tuesday and think about that. You know, we're here in the Northern Virginia area, so I can think about it a little bit in that context. But I think that one of the things that is happening a great deal, and one of the things that we're seeing really play out in some of the elections that took place this week, is the question of polarization and dividing the electorate. And certainly I think polarization of the electorate is often a goal of character assassination campaigns, right? So when people assassinate the character of their opponents, they're not just seeking to make that person not get elected, they're seeking a stark rejection of fundamental parts of that opponent's character. So I think the character assassination tactics that, of course, Donald Trump is so known for using are really tools in a broader campaign of trying to polarize the electorate. Now, I'll say one more thing about that, which is that one of the things that Northam's victory in the Virginia gubernatorial elections has been sort of hailed as a rejection of the polarization and the discord that candidates like Trump have been sowing among the population. And so as Northam accepted his win, you know, he talked about, this is a rejection of polarization. This means that we want to move forward with unity. And I think we need to take those messages with a grain of salt, right? Because if you look at what actually happened during the Virginia election, you know, the message of unity and niceness wasn't necessarily echoed in Northam's campaign advertisements, right? I mean, he ran one that called Trump a narcissistic maniac, I believe, and then he sort of backed off later in the election. But I think that even these messages of unity that sort of seem to be coming from a lot of the Democratic candidates that won on Tuesday night, we're still done with some tactics that we might consider as part of character assassination campaigns.
Let me ask, how, and any one of you can jump in on this, how transferable is this license to go negative? Because one of the things is that Ed Gillespie, who was the Republican candidate in Virginia, he clearly took a playbook from the Trump campaign in terms of, you know, adding certain racial issues. And the analysis is that, you know, he adopted those tactics, but he kept himself distanced from Donald Trump himself. And the analysis now is that, well, he was trying to have it both ways. He was trying to use that playbook, but without, you know, to basically run on a Trump platform without Trump. So I'm just wondering, what does that tell you as researchers about the difference between the message and the messenger when it comes to character assassination?
First of all, this is Eric Sharayev. Thank you for hosting us, for moderating this. We have to understand that a negative campaign and a criticism of any politician is different from character assassination in many ways. Because I can be very critical of a policy or a position that a person has about certain social, political, cultural issue. It's one thing. And the other thing is I go after the person's individual qualities. So instead of saying she is absolutely wrong by supporting X and Y and Z, it's a criticism of her policy. The other thing is just to say, well, she is not qualified because she tortures rabbits in her backyard. Or she is, well, 10 years ago, unfortunately, she has a problem with alcohol. So it's true or not, but just by emphasizing her personal weakness or problem, I imply, I hint, and I directly suggest that her policies are not good. And it's an important point that's when we consolidate political force, when go in the middle, and it's a strategy which is accepted by many, let's get middle of the road, the moderates. It's one thing, but the other strategy that works, and studies at least Eagleman 10, 15 years ago show clearly, negative campaigning works. If we polarize, as we, unfortunately not we, but politicians go after individual qualities, try just to either use just lies or exaggerations or slander, simply just associate a political candidate or individual or successful teacher or scientist with negative qualities that translate into negative perception of her research, his political position, or any positive record.
Let me ask this. Let's talk a bit more about polarization, because I think that's an interesting dynamic. It came up a couple times already, and you know, as we learn more about the social media role in the election last year, and even some of the funding that was going into a lot of the messages, even though messages would have either been begun by you know, I guess you could say members who were really sort of paid to share these opinions, but even genuine opinions were then fostered and propagated by some of these organized efforts. so that these messages populated across social media in ways that seemed very organic, but were really orchestrated. And I think what was interesting, in at least some of the analysis that I've been reading, is that the specific issues, a lot of it was anti-Hillary, but there was also some anti-Trump, and the idea was to polarize the debate, almost as a priming factor for what can then, have the breakdown of democracy. So I guess what I'm asking is, when we think of polarization, is it the same thing as character assassination itself, or is it almost like a precursor activity that then makes the character assassination more effective? So just what's that dynamic between character assassination and polarizing audiences? Maybe Martin Nix, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think character assassination can often be used as a tool to create polarization. And as an outsider, I'd want to give another perspective on American politics, because what strikes me, looking at this from a European perspective, is that polarization and character assassination seem much more rife in American political culture than, for instance, in many European continental countries, at least. And I think one reason for that is that there's a different political system in place, where in many European countries you will have coalition governments. That means that those politicians often know that even if they smear each other now, they'll have to form a coalition and cooperate again tomorrow. So they tend to moderate their smears at one another much more than happens in an American situation, I think. And where you typically see character assassination happening in our context is often on the political fringes, with extreme populist figures, for instance, who will say really outrageous things, but mainstream politicians will try to steer. In America, and I think also in the UK, you've got a very different situation, because there's usually a two-party system. So it's a zero-sum game where the winner gets everything and the loser is left with nothing, which is really also inducing and encouraging, in a way, using character assassination as a tool to try and polarize people and make sure that as many as possible come to your side.
Or perhaps don't come out at all.
Yes, or that, yes. Either let them stay at home or make sure that they will vote for your candidate.
Yeah, we had a comment on our chat from Rodney Karavath. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. By going Trumpian with attacks against Latinos and embracing statues, Gillespie, that would be Ed Gillespie in Virginia, turned off independents and suburban women, killed his chances in Northern Virginia. And the reason I mention that is, as Martin just mentioned, in a political system where, it's a winner-take-all dynamic among the candidates, but the demographics can be hugely complicated, from socioeconomic to geographic location. It's got to be a very difficult calculus when you're thinking about a statewide or certainly a national campaign, to calibrate your messages to all these different demographics, and then, as we mentioned, polarizing. So with that in mind, maybe Sergei Samoyenko, your thoughts on character assassination across different demographics. How does that play out when we have a sort of a very complicated tapestry of interests and economic and geographic and all sorts of other variables?
Well, I just want to mention a few words about the American political environment, because I'm more familiar with how things work here. And in addition to what Eric, Jenny, and Martin have said, we have a lot of things right now where we see people being polarized, not just because of their ideologies, but about, cultural preferences and about, some certain stakes in pretty much in the culture that we see right now. I would like to point out that also what we face right now is this huge redistribution of power across different media platforms, even because when we look about polarization, we have to think what causes polarization. And one thing is, of course, that politicians, because of, they trying to adopt this media logic, they have to pretty much summarize their main points into very short bites, and they really have to pretty much communicate it quickly. And they sometimes only take extreme points to communicate to the public. The second thing is that now we have a lot of people who can frame their own issues, and they can use their own media platforms pretty much to propagate their own frames and their own public policies. At this point, they can actually generate their own agendas. So at this point, it creates more and more polarization, and it's coming also because the media environment has become so fragmented, so split at this point. So it's not what we had even like 5 years ago.
Can I jump in on this too, actually, before we move on? I think Rod's point is really well taken. Also, hi, Rod. Thanks for thanks for streaming along with us today.
Yeah.
I think that the demographic and audience-based dynamics of character assassination are really, really important. I come at studying character assassination from the perspective of rhetoric, and rhetoric basically just means looking at persuasion and how persuasive tactics work. And so obviously the key thing in understanding persuasion is understanding who the audience is. And so certain ads or certain persuasive messages are going to resonate with certain voters and not with other voters. So fundamentally, character assassination plays out in communication activities, whether it's social media posts, negative campaign advertisements, or any number of other ways that we see communication being used as the tool to conduct character assassination campaigns. And certainly the demographic dynamics of, and we'll take Virginia again as the example since that's where we are. Well, that's not where I'm at, and I don't actually know where Serge is, but one of the contexts that we're familiar with here is that the New York Times is calling the victory of Northam over Gillespie in the Virginia gubernatorial race as a suburban revolt, right? As a sort of remaking of the lines of the electorate that had widely supported Trump. And Rod's exactly right that immigrant voters, people of color, women, overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but chose to vote for Northam. And so I think this is all especially complicated when we start talking about ad and media buys. What messages do you run when you're trying to capture a state that's as large and diverse as Virginia? And thinking about
let me ask about that, and to any and all of you, because one of the terms that came up is this idea that when a candidate is delivering a message, there may be what they call a dog whistle message. A dog whistle, you blow it, humans don't hear it, but the dogs do. And it is a form of, reaching that audience without necessarily tipping it off to the broader population that you're reaching that audience. And in fact, I think that some of the analysis said that in terms of some of the racial dynamics, that Gillespie, it was not just a dog whistle, but a mating call. That was one of the terms that was used. But I bring that up again, not for any, drilling down on that particular race, but in terms of that as a vector for sending messages. I mean, character assassination in its rawest form, I think, as Eric mentioned, might be, and that he tortures bunnies and this or that. But what are some of the more subtle ways to assassinate character that if we're not listening, we may not even pick up on it? The dog whistles out there.
I can give an example, and once again, it will be definitely an example that sways away from polarization. Imagine a person applies for tenure, and the research, its accomplishments, and then person B spreads a rumor saying, well, in the past, this individual was really loose with her statistical analysis, just really, really loose, just we don't know how, just come up with numbers. And so in the past, so I'm saying nothing about contemporary research, but I'm implying that person maybe, I didn't say it, but I'm implying that she was a liar. She was a cheater. And probably many people in the committee will not be swayed, but some will be. And they would ask more questions, and raise doubts, and then this character assassination is in progress. We don't polarize anybody, but just we're simply targeting few individuals who will be more gullible and more willing to accept those rumors or just my innuendo about this person's being dishonest. And there we go. The target is set, and character assassination is in progress. And person may not get her tenure at least this year.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm really rooting for that person to have tenure, especially after all the problems they had previously. You know, that type of thing.
Yes.
I'd like to. We've got a couple questions from our chat window that I'd like to pass along. There's a couple in the queue here that I want to get to, but there's one from someone who identifies as Old Book Guy, number 1, Josh Compton. He wants to know what the panelists, what their take is on reactive versus proactive means of dealing with character assassination. And I'm glad he raised that. The reason I raise it now, or put his out there, is that at the conference back in March that the CARP Center had, there was a lot that was talked about this concept of inoculating against character assassination attacks. Just as in the medical realm where we would inoculate against a disease because we know it's out there, we know it's toxic, we know that it will, you know, undo the fabric of society by making us sick. Well, character assassination is very, very similar, and there's a lot that's been written and talked about in terms of inoculating proactively, letting somebody know, hey, you may be hearing this or that. So I wanted to sort of like, maybe perhaps we can talk about that balance between proactive and reactive, and when we get proactive with inoculation, how do we do it in a way that doesn't just put it on people's minds when maybe they weren't thinking about it? Maybe Sergey?
I can jump in.
Oh yeah, Eric. Anybody?
Sorry for I did just don't know monopolize, just a couple of words basically. Yes, true. Like in health studies in medicine, just doctors suggest us about our vulnerabilities, something genetic, something that's a lifestyle, something just things we've done, and so there's certain areas vulnerable, blood pressure or digestive system. Same thing in character assassination studies. We are working on composing a profile, helping people composing a profile. Any person who is socially active, any person who is successful professionally, academically, or has political aspirations, has to have this list of vulnerabilities and be ready for possible attacks. For example, well, being divorced twice, unfortunately, could be liability. Just undergoing treatment for depression, unfortunately, can be liability because we have huge stigma of mental illness in the United States. Attending at age 17 a witch meeting just out of curiosity. Who are the witches? I want to see what's going on. That's vulnerability. So anything we've done in the past and become public knowledge, it can become public, is vulnerability. And we suggest people just those who have aspirations, just be careful, prepare this list, and be prepared to answer in advance.
I want to jump in on this too, actually, and it's interesting that Dr. Compton is asking us this question because he is certainly far and away the leading researcher on inoculation attempts in persuasion. So happy to have you listening along and joining us. And I think, you know, inoculation against persuasion research is something that's been going on for well over 50 years now, and the research empirically seems to suggest that it does actually work to prevent people from being persuaded by those later attempts, whether they're character assassination or otherwise. And I think if we think about it sort of from an audience perspective too, it largely does make sense for us, right? My opponent is going to tell you that I am not an experienced leader, but don't believe them. In fact, my inexperience actually makes me more creative at thinking through some of the problems facing our town. And so while it might raise some questions that the audience hadn't already been thinking about, Eric's exactly right. We can predict what those things are going to be by looking at the profiles of certain candidates and comparing them to our social understanding of how those character traits and associations are understood within a particular culture. The last thing I'll say too is that argumentation scholars have been saying for years that especially if your audience is diverse, creating a two-sided case is typically more effective in persuading a broader swath of that audience. So showing both the benefits of your side, showing the other side, and then pointing out why those arguments aren't as strong. So I think ultimately the research is pretty clear that inoculation can have a very powerful effect on preventing character assassination attempts from sticking to candidates.
Larry O'Hanlon passed on a question via our chat. What are some typical ways in which character assassination backfires? Anybody?
Well, I can say a few words about that maybe, because it's one thing that we are very intrigued by, and where I think we would like to have more empirical data as well to see why in certain situations character attacks are successful while in other situations they fail. I think a lot of it has to do with the position that the target has. So the reason that we prefer the term target to the term victim is that not everyone who is attacked by a character attacker automatically becomes a victim. Sometimes the attack bounces off, and in fact the victim will be the person who originally launched the attack in the first place. A victim or a target can have the sympathy of the audience, for instance, and the audience can feel that an accusation is made that's being really unfair. So, for instance, a very misogynistic attack might actually backfire because it makes the attacker look bad because he has such backward ideas of women, rather than hurt the female candidate that he's trying to hurt.
Well, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I'm thinking back to the 2000 Senate race in New York when Hillary Clinton ran against someone named Rick Lazio. And one of the pivotal points in that race was when Rick Lazio, it was at a debate, a live debate, and at one point he was accusing her of some issue, some shortcoming, but the way he did it was to leave from behind his panel and just walk up to her in a threatening way and pointing at her, and he really suffered politically from that. And then, of course, you know, you think of the same candidate for president, Hillary Rodham Clinton, last year, and then that pivotal moment in one of their debates where Donald Trump was perceived as looming, you know, near her as she was answering. And she even wrote about it in her book that she felt like she should have turned around and said, you know, get away, you creep. Like, are those examples of backfiring and over time, over the history? And this does tee up a question that I have coming about history from somebody online. But over time, has that type of physical intimidation changed? Is it more effective, less effective?
I think it's more likely to backfire.
Look at the audience, actually, and sorry, Martin, for jumping in. Pretty much, I mean, if you look at the history, the social perception of certain things have changed. Like, you know, if you look about the youth, remember how youth used to be a sin back in medieval times, and a lot of character assassination attacks were against like young rulers, right? Not anymore. You know, things have changed.
Also, I can give an example, very simple, very quickly, that back in 1980s, the Soviet Communist Press launched a tremendous character attack against Boris Yeltsin for being a drunk, for being incohesive, for being flamboyant idiot, and yet it didn't work because most of the country was suspicious of a communist press already, and therefore they just took side of Yeltsin. In fact, he was drunk, he was flamboyant, and yet just the attacks, I think, backfired against him. So when the audience, and Jennifer right, if the audience is really against some issues, or for candidate, and the character attacks are likely to backfire in the eyes of his or her supporters.
Well, that raises an interesting question, Eric, because this just in the 2016 election, you know, Donald Trump, you know, his views on women, a lot of people were outraged by it, but there were others that saying, well, you know, whether it was that or other issues, that he has a history of being brash. So even though folks are bringing up these what might be considered character flaws or character traits, they don't conflict with a previous image that he's had of himself. And with Yeltsin, so for instance, if people are pointing out shortcomings, but people, if it's sort of a historically been part of his character, even though I guess what I'm asking is, if something is known versus something that seems new and contradictory to what the previous image was, does that make a difference? We see the Senate candidate Roy Moore, who just yesterday, the Washington Post reported that teenagers said that when he was in his 30s and a young lawyer, he made advances at them, and he's under fire now from his own party for the special election to replace Jeff Sessions. And one of the reasons that the analysis is because he holds himself up as a very upstanding, conservative, socially conservative individual. So that's a roundabout way of asking, does a character attack, for it to work, does it have to give some new or conflicting information over what people already sort of think or perceive about a person?
Well, what's certainly true, I think, is that if you can frame someone as being somehow a threat or somehow dangerous to the status quo, that triggers people and makes them pay more close attention than they might otherwise would. Because a lot of information, as Eric can certainly confirm as well, is filtered through our brains, and we make a distinction between what's relevant and what isn't. So you really need something that raises a red flag with the audience that you're trying to target. If it's something that they'll see coming anyway, like saying Yeltsin is a drunk, yeah, nobody's going to be surprised. That's not going to be very effective. If you say, for instance, someone has ties with another country, is trying to undermine democracy or whatever, that might raise people's suspicions, and then they might be willing to reevaluate what they think of the person. But I think it depends a lot on the source it's coming from. Is that person or that news medium being perceived as credible, or are they considered to be biased anyway? And of course, how much sympathy you already have for the target. Mm-hmm.
We have another question online. I think this is from Lorik Borges. According to your experts, what historical study of character assassination, what can a historical perspective bring to our understanding of modern examples of character assassination? And it's a very good question, because even in your foundational language about the CARP research lab and what it's about, one of the focus areas is the history and historical examples and what their relevance are for today.
Yeah, certainly. I think history has a lot to teach us about these things. For one thing, it gives us other cultures and other places to compare our own situation with. So just like it might be instructive to, for instance, look at character assassination in the US and compare that to a character assassination as it occurs in, let's say, Russia, China, or Europe. You can learn a lot from that comparison. It's also very instructive to juxtapose modern cultures to cultures from previous days, because they will bring out things that might not otherwise be quite as clear. So how does character assassination, for instance, function in a society that does not yet have modern mass media? How do the media shape character assassination? You can learn a lot about that from looking at societies where that isn't the case. Another important reason, I think, is that people have been thinking and practicing character assassination for thousands of years. We even have instruction books from Roman times about how can you best attack the character of your opponents. So it's also interesting to take these theories on board and see how people have been thinking about this for a long time. I certainly think we shouldn't discard their thinking just because it happened hundreds of years ago. I think we can actually learn a lot from that as well.
I think I'd like to jump in on that too. And certainly I wholeheartedly endorse everything Martin is saying, that history has a lot to tell us about what happens today. One of the things that I've been studying, I broadly study red baiting in the American labor movement, but have also done some studies of Senator Joseph McCarthy and how his attacks on famous newsman Edward R. Murrow played out on some television programs. And one of the great things about studying that case, and what I was trying to understand in that case, is why was Murrow's attack on McCarthy so successful? And the flip side, why was McCarthy's attack back on Murrow so unsuccessful? And one of the things that I have enjoyed the ability to study as a result of choosing this historical case is that there's a lot of data for me to look at in terms of how some of these attacks were understood and played out in the media, right? So I can look at NBC's archives and show the thousands of letters that people wrote in supporting Edward R. Murrow. And I can read the newspaper coverage of TV critics responding to the attack ads that basically each of them aired against each other. So I can really see, based on an amalgamation of historical data that has had decades to collect, how these attacks played out in the media. And now certainly taking a historical perspective does limit your ability to gather some types of data, right? I can't track clicks on Facebook, for instance, but I can gather data that has collected over decades to help give us kind of a richer understanding of what happened in that particular example of character assassination.
Well, you know, that raises another issue. It's, you know, the idea of taking a stand. And, you know, for quite some time, you know, Senator McCarthy got a lot of traction, but then there was that one hearing on June 9th, one witness said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And that was perceived as a turning point where there's almost like he was called on it, and that really sort of shifted the tide. And if you look at a recent case where Jeff Flake, Senator Flake, decided he wasn't going to run again, and he gave a very impassioned speech in announcing that, and had some very similar messages in terms of, you know, when are we going to stop buying into, you know, this divisive, you know, political rhetoric we're hearing from President Trump. But there wasn't, at least not yet, there didn't seem to be that same kind of aha moment where people sort of, you know, the moral shift turned on that person taking a stand. So what are the differences between the two situations? Is it not just taking a stand, but does it have to be who's doing it, or what the timing is? What goes into that?
I'll jump on that first quickly. I think the sort of framework or metaphor of tide is actually really important, in particular for the Murrow and McCarthy case. So Murrow's attack on McCarthy, which aired on NBC, I think, yeah, NBC, was actually kind of at the end of a swell of people starting to express their disagreements with the very vitriolic and divisive tactics that McCarthy was using to drive alleged communists out of the US government. So I think one of the things that really shifted in that moment was a combination of all sorts of people starting to come together and make the same argument of, wow, he's kind of stepping over the line here with his, you know, browbeating questions in these hearings and that kind of thing. Likewise, the example that you point to in the Army McCarthy hearings, where they ask, "Have you at long last, sir, no sense of decency?" was televised for thousands of people to watch. So you had that soundbitey moment that added to what was becoming a gradual groundswell of you know, sentiment shifting against McCarthy. And the last thing I'll say is that what you said at the end there, I think, is absolutely right, and piggybacks on what Martin had said before as well, that who does the attack matters a great deal as well, right? So Edward R. Murrow was one of the most trusted and respected men in America in the 1950s, and had even been bandied about as a vice presidential candidate, right? This was back at a time when the news and the evening news was so fundamentally a trustworthy voice. People had been watching Murrow cover World War II in London. So his qualities as a trustworthy and credible source, I think, meant a great deal for why his attacks really helped build upon what was an already growing sense of turning against McCarthy.
And back then, the broadcasting was a much smaller, there were a lot fewer options. So that gravitas was, he had, you know, the field to himself compared to, you know, all the different options that you have. Rodney Carveth online on the chat, he made an observation. When McCarthy took on Murrow, his response was amateurish, and compared to a slick production of Murrow, see it now. And he also pointed out the difference between radio and TV or print. When McCarthy did very well in the radio and print media, but he came across as unkempt bully on TV, especially when going after the young colleague of Joseph Welch.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think one thing that also goes along with what you said before, Richard, is that timing matters immensely. Rod is absolutely right. McCarthy's response to Murrow was this wandering, bullying rejoinder, and he looked unhinged. I mean, his hair was sweaty and all over his forehead, and he just looked like a crazy person. But the other thing is that McCarthy had waited a month to air his response to Murrow. So by that point, Murrow's words had already circulated through all the major newspapers, and so timing absolutely does matter. McCarthy didn't jump on it early enough.
We have someone named Maureen online who asks, what are CARP's current and future activities?
We're busy on several projects. First of all,
this is the current one, of course, but what are the future ones?
This is the current one, right. We're talking about the Routledge Handbook that will be coming out next year, and that we're currently writing and revising articles for. What we'd also very much like to do in the future is to write a textbook to be used in university courses, where we would present cases of character assassination in different categories to students, so that courses on character assassination can be taught and awareness of the mechanisms of character assassination can be raised with people, so that they in a sense perhaps are also inoculated against it. We'd also like to do more research that would enable us to advise people who are dealing with character assassination attempts on how best to respond to those, or how best to prepare for those, to make sure that they cause as little damage as possible.
Other panelists on maybe what might be coming up, or what other activities are on the radar?
Sergey, now.
What'd you say?
Eric?
We are planning, yes, certainly planning our next international seminar or conference, but it will be probably in a year and a half from now, and we will choose a venue. And also Sergey Samolenko is planning several smaller events will be here in Virginia, Maryland. So this is what in our plans, and we'll be constantly updating and telling.
Martin mentioned case studies and examples, use cases of situations. Do you have any system set up, or are you contemplating maybe a way to crowdsource suggestions from that? Like, I'm just impressed by some of the questions we're getting on the topics that come up. If people think of cases of character assassination, things to sort of grist for the mill, is there a way for them to share that with you?
We more than welcome them, absolutely. More than welcome. Personal cases, lesser known, well-known cases, just we will certainly welcome.
Well, so I'll say a couple of other things about that too. One thing that Martin and Eric did not mention is that we recently launched a new website for the CARP Lab, and as part of that website, we've created a blog. And the blog is intended to be, not our formal research papers, but our reactions and some political commentary, some general thoughts about the character assassination that we're seeing in current events and that type of thing. So that's been, I think, a really great way for us to keep writing about it and to share some thoughts designed more for a general audience than an academic audience. Mm-hmm. And so that website also has a place where you can contact us, and we certainly welcome, as Eric mentioned, tell us about cases we don't know about. Our webmaster, Katya, would love to help work with you on writing a guest blog post. So if you have something that you want to write about or something that you've been noticing in the news, we would love to host it on our CARP Lab website, or link to something you've been writing or thinking about as well. Because certainly in the age of social media, the character assassination attacks are proliferating, and we can't keep up with them all, but we also want to study and to understand what's interesting to all of these other great scholars that we've been lucky enough to kind of start building a network with over the last couple years. We're also on Facebook, so if you have like our page on Facebook, you can post interesting things that you find in the news there, and that can help give us some more meat to write about for our blog.
It's interesting. We talked a little bit about the history of character assassination, and then we're hearing about some of the things that the CARP lab is doing, and it strikes me that part of the history of character assassination is that now there is a framework for studying it through the CARP research lab, and so I'm wondering, how is that going to change character assassination? I mean, in some ways we'll have tools to fight it, but in other ways, practitioners of character assassination will maybe understand it more. It just seems like.
Let me just take on this. I see our research as an actual advocacy. It's a statement by people who care about those issues on a journey to join us and to discover more cases and instances so we can those things from happening in the future. So at this point, I look at character assassination as a disease that needs to be studied before we come up with ways how to treat it. I mean, it's a type of scientific advocacy. Even right now, I mean, you look at those cases where character assassination is blended with fake news or alternative facts, example, disinformations, and they used against scientific community, they used against some activists, and I think a lot of people can benefit from it.
And also we contribute to scholarship. Basically, Sergei himself taught a course on character assassination. Martin teaches classes on character assassination. So just we're contributing something to scholarship as well. Yes, scientific advocacy, absolutely true. And also just the will to develop.
One of the things we've also been thinking about is in what instances might character assassination be justified, right? So while there might be the concern that putting all of this information out there about character assassination might compel people to do it more and to say, oh, hey, here's a great way I can take down my opponent. At the same time, I at least, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my other panelists here, am not 100% convinced that character assassination is always a bad thing. So trying to think through what a broader framework for understanding it is might then ultimately help us, figure out what in society we want to do about it, if anything. And I mean, truthfully, it's not going away, right? It's not just a Trump thing. It's not just a polarization thing. The history record is clear. Character assassination has been around for forever. So, understanding, as Serge said, is kind of the first step. And while we do want to offer our services to help people who feel like they have been targeted, we also, I think, need to think through some of the ethical implications of, is it ever a good thing? Are there ever moments where character assassination is justified?
That's intriguing. So let me ask the other panelist, what's your thought about what Jenny just meant, that some character assassination is not necessarily a bad thing?
Yeah, can I respond to that? Because I think it's important. I agree with Jenny, actually, that there might be cases conceivable where it's not a bad thing. But I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about character assassination, we do not necessarily make a distinction between allegations that are true and allegations that are false. I know that in common speech, people often reserve the term character assassination just for allegations that are not true. But we think that the main point is not whether it's true or not, but whether or not it actually damages someone's reputation. Sometimes an accusation can be perfectly true, but still meant and brought into the world to destroy a political opponent. So that's why I think you can take a different ethical view of it as well, because if there is indeed a hidden skeleton in the closet, and it would be a good thing for a certain politician to be brought down and that to be made open, then we would still define it as character assassination, because it's done with the express aim to destroy that person's reputation. But in that case, it might be fully justified.
Certainly. How do you deal with a hypocrite? How do you deal with an imposter? Certainly, if somebody in politics represents self as a decent person, but in fact we think that person is an imposter, and we have facts about that, so we can reveal it. It's character attacks, certainly, but probably they're justifiable because we try to simply uncover a case of hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to maybe sort of close the loop and maybe get any final thoughts or observations from each one of you, just very briefly before we bring today to a close.
Yeah, I'm very happy that we're doing this, and I hope that the people watching and interacting with us also are willing to reach out and send us their thoughts, send us, as we were discussing earlier, cases that they might know of, that they've experienced themselves, because we're very open to feedback and to talking about this with people who have somehow been involved in character assassination themselves, or want to study it or know more about it.
We're doing something very important, because just in 1 year we were able to build such a strong community. You know, people from different countries have joined us. Optimistic about what we'll be doing in the future, helping people, trying to understand those cases and maybe come up with strategies how to counter some of those attacks. So I'm very happy with doing this, and I would like to thank my colleagues for work and just for camaraderie. I think it's very important that we work as a team.
We are post-partisan. We invite people, professionals and non-professional alike, to join us, contribute, and just diversity as our strength.
I guess my closing thoughts are these. I'll certainly echo what my co-panelists said in feeling so lucky and excited to be a part of this network. I think the conference that we hosted at George Mason in March really spoke to the interdisciplinary nature of character assassination. And you know, we're scholars from psychology, from history, from communication, but there are so many other ways to understand character assassination. And my viewpoint is that we need them all in order to be able to create a rich picture of how this happens, how it works, what we can do about it, what the ethical implications of it are. All of those are questions that we need all of the perspectives in order to help us understand. So truly for me, what's been so remarkable is the interdisciplinary nature of character assassination and of the great scholars that have come together to help us study it. And as I said before, fundamentally attacking the character of opponents, political or otherwise, isn't going anywhere. So I think the best thing that we can do is to try to understand it and to think about moving forward how it is we can make the communication that we circulate here, you know, the strongest and richest that it can be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. A final comment that I see online from Mitch Marovitz, he said it raises the question of the term character assassination. His sense is that character assassination is never a good thing. If a person deserves to have his or her reputation damaged, then it's not an assassination. So I'd be interested as in the future of CARP whether that terminology will evolve or not. And any final thoughts on that? Well, you like the name? All right. Well, that does it. And then there was one other comment from Florian Krupp, who said it would be fruitful to teach a class character assassination throughout the ages of history. Yeah. And I would definitely like to thank all of our panelists, Martin Ix, Eric Sharayev, Jenny Cohane, Sergei Semolyenko, and definitely Katya Bizel. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, because Katya was the one who really did a lot of the legwork and making sure this happened and keeping everyone on track and scheduling. So we're really grateful for her help as well, and certainly grateful to everybody who took the time to watch and to give some questions. We really, my sense is we should do this again. Don't you all think so?
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you, Richard, for being our moderator.
By all means.
Yes,
So
thank you.
that does it for today. Thank you so much for joining our panel here online, and be sure to keep up with our activities. Katya and others will circulate more information, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for watching.
Bye.